welcome to another episode of Frame and Reference. I'm your host, Kenny McMillan, and today we're talking with Herse, the DP of the show The Afterparty. He also shot Barry, but a little peek behind the curtain, this interview was recorded 2 months ago. So there was an onslaught of interviews a couple months ago, and so it's, there's only 4 weeks in a month. So now we've gotten to Carl, but well worth your time. We talk about the importance of the home video era. I certainly talked a lot about that with DPs on this podcast, DVD special features and all that, and how they inspired all of us, especially being able to see, movies that weren't blockbusters necessarily, by going to a blockbuster. we talk about the LED revolution, so to speak, using visual effects effectively instead of to fix problems, but sort of like digital tools from beyond, all kinds of stuff. And obviously we talked about his work on The Afterparty, which every episode has like a different theme and visual style. So he got a lot of reps in on the show, a lot of different work that a lot of different muscles he was able to flex, so to speak. So excellent episode. I hope you'll enjoy it. Please enjoy. What a weird dismount. Here is my conversation with Herse. Since you've heard it, you probably know, but our first question on this podcast is always just asking what got you into cinematography or filmmaking in general? Like, were you always a visual person, or were you, kind of taking a different path?
No, yeah. When I was really young, I was, an avid, really into drawing and writing little short stories and stuff. And growing up in the Midwest, we didn't have a whole lot to do other than go to video stores. And we spent a lot of time kind of wandering. I loved going and just wandering down all the different alleys and scaring myself in the horror section or running over to the kids section or whatever. And I think the two things, interests kind of converged. And I was never like a comic book person, but I started doing these little drawn stories that were essentially early storyboards. And I think that kind of, I kind of realized slowly that there were people making these films that I was really liking. And when I was like 10 years old, my mom was she really wanted to push that creativity. So she signed me up for this thing that was at the public access station in the little town I grew up in, where they would invite people and they'd kind of give them a little crash course in film production. And so when I was like 10, I got to write and direct this little public access thing, and kind of everyone else that was there were adults or seeming to be adults. Right. And so I was kind of this weird kid that was trying to learn what was going on. And that turned into a few years of like just hanging around this public access station. The people there were really nice to me. They would give me raw footage and say, edit this, or, figure out how this would go together. And so I would just do that in like middle school. And by the time I got to high school, I really that was how I approached any project, any report. If I had to do a Romeo and Juliet report, it was like, I'm going to make a little short film or something as my kind of a way of completing this project. And so I was not the most studious kid, but I had a little world of very lo-fi filmmaking going on with a couple of VHS decks and
nightmare editing,
analogs, doing my own phase, and a CD player that you hit play on right at the part you want the music to come in or whatever. And then by the time I got to high school, I was really interested in it enough that I wanted to start a film club. And we were lucky enough to have a little like TV production course kind of thing that incredible teacher, this guy, Jeff Van Davis, who was like an old documentary filmmaker, was working there. And he really kind of opened my world up to realizing that film was more than just entertainment and that it could also be art. And we kind of started a little film club, and we're watching movies that were well beyond our years pretty early on. And that, I assumed that I wanted to be a director at that point in my life, because I didn't really know what there was beyond directing. I watched all the little making of videos that I could find of Jurassic Park or whatever. And I understood that there was a whole crew of people out there, but I didn't really know my place at that point. And then I kind of realized over the course of that high school film enthusiast experience that I was really interested in the mechanics of filmmaking and the camera specifically. But when I first decided to study cinematography in college, I really didn't know anything about lighting or, the nitty gritty of what all is involved and how much of your life is spent chasing schedules and
Right.
working long hours and things. But yeah, I learned pretty quickly that cinematography was what I was excited about. And so then I focused for years on lighting and worked as an electrician and just decided to try to commit to learning that side of things, which slowly kind of led to now.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the substituting videos for projects. I absolutely did that in high school. Luckily, editing mini DVs, so I wasn't having to do reel to reel or whatever, deck to deck. But anytime there was like a report or something, I was like, I can do a video version, and my teachers were just like, wow, that's incredible. I always got like the same thing, not very studious at all.
Yeah, but got lucky with some cool teachers to let me do my thing.
Yeah. Do you remember sort of, maybe not the exact film, but the kind of films that kind of brought you from thinking of movies as entertainment into sort of a higher art form, so to speak?
I mean, I think it was stuff that kind of crosses between entertainment. Like I remember like the Coen, we're talking like early 90s, and it was really like the Coen brothers, the early P.T. Anderson stuff that was like had good cast, good stories, and that kind of then was like the first step towards like, oh, what is beyond that? And then you're looking at Kubrick or Robert Altman movies or whatever. And but I think it was that kind of that, it also, like everybody, it starts with, or at least everyone of my generation, it starts with some Spielberg and Lucas and that kind of stuff, right. James Cameron and watching Die Hard movies and stuff like that. But then I think I was, growing up in this interesting time where independent films there were a lot of them. They had some decent budgets or some really amazing people working earlier in their career that brought really new, interesting ideas like Soderbergh and stuff to the table that made it feel like, oh my God, there's real people doing this. It's not just this otherness that's happening out in Hollywood. It's like, oh, there's people all over the country. And I remember when that documentary American Movie came out, there were people, I grew up in the Midwest, so seeing people that looked and talked like my uncles making films and stuff was so just like jaw dropping, like, oh my God, these are people in like Milwaukee doing this. And granted, it's arguable what the quality of that stuff is, but the film, that's the kind of stuff that made me think like, wow, this is a real career path. And I was lucky enough that my parents were very supportive of it, and they were like, all right, that's what you want to do, which I think is based on talking with others who I work with. That's not always how the conversation goes.
Yeah. It's interesting. I often attribute any success I have to having a supportive mom and dad, in different capacities, but definitely like, there's definitely a difference between supportive and hands off, and maybe I landed in the middle where they were like, yeah, if you want to do that, you figure that out. It's a lot less like, let's help.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely it's a weird path. I think no one really knows how to react to it. They're like, you want to, okay, interesting.
Right. We've talked about it before on this podcast, but do you maybe have any sort of tangential insight into why that era of like 90s films was so, I mean, obviously it's formative for the people who grew up in it, but they seem to have endured longer than just nostalgia. There seems to be a specific craft or mastery of the art form within that, not just that chunk, but specifically there.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there was a time where studios were making more movies, and there was a little bit more ability to get your movie made at a decent budget level, even if it was kind of fringe. But I also, to go back to the home video thing, I think I just grew up in a period where films that weren't necessarily going to be a knockout of the theaters could still do really well in the home video market. Right. And a lot of stuff was discovered in that market that led to those filmmakers being kind of appreciated and worth investing in. in a way that I think didn't quite exist. I think there's always an art house world, and there's obviously the Kurosawas and the Kubricks before even the 70s guys and everything. But
Right.
I feel like we just got this, or, again, I look through it with my own like nostalgia, but I think I wound up kind of growing up in a really interesting time for independent film.
Yeah. No, the definitely I've heard people talk about that. I think it was Matt Damon on Hot Ones was mentioning
Mhm.
how like deep one of the main reasons why we don't see indie film so much anymore is because of a lack of DVD purchases. People don't tend to buy Blu-rays and DVDs and
Mhm.
stuff, which is wild because I'm definitely a hard media type. Like I'm a special features nerd. You
Yeah.
know, that was
Yeah.
definitely part of my film education.
I mean, that was the best too. That was another thing that was so special about that period, especially when DVDs started coming out, is that they would package them with all the making of stuff. And as a, you know, teenager at that point, it was just fascinating to be able to see all, how, behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, they definitely made. That's actually an interesting point. You kind of touched on it earlier, but how do you think was sort of that era the sort of dawn of film being accessible? Because that's something I've heard a few folks talk about in regards to YouTube. Not YouTube, but like maybe content generation for that thing. I was talking to a cinematographer named Chris Ray. He primarily shoots skateboard videos, and he found that they got less attention when he shot them like on reds, really dramatic, shot over style
Mhm.
helicopter cams. He's like, that stuff looks great, but the stuff that pops the most is what he just kind of shoots, simply skating with them.
Right.
And he mentioned that it was because it seemed accessible. Like people thought like, oh, I can do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely could be a part of it. I feel like even like you're looking at the way that mini DV was embraced by the film community, like, hey, this allows more people to tell stories, more people are going to be doing it, and therefore you've got these like wild filmmakers showing up that you would not have heard of otherwise because they, you know, read Robert Rodriguez's book and decided let's do it. And,
That and the art of the cut, yeah.
Mhm.
Or no, what? Sorry, Cutting Edge. Remember that? Did they make you watch that documentary?
No, what's that?
It's Walter Murch's editing documentary, but they made
Oh,
us watch it in film school, like, well, college, but probably once a year at least, or one, because there'd be like the editing class, and then there'd be like an advanced editing class, and then there'd be like, all right, this is directing, but first we got to know how it's going to be edited. So we got this movie here, and we're just like, son of a bitch, it's always the cutting edge.
yeah, yeah, that's hilarious.
Yeah. So, do you? I've asked this before, but do you remember like a specific kind of set of special features that really like made you go like, oh, that's the one. That's versus the sort of just high that you get from watching the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there was, I feel like there's just a whole generation of people that saw the Star Wars stuff and they're like, oh my God, what is this? And then I remember seeing a lot of, I could find like the James Cameron stuff, like even the first Terminator film. There was a VHS tape floating around the town I grew up in that you could get at the video store. It was like 30 minutes and you just showed you like, young Arnold Schwarzenegger sitting in a car and how they did these different things. And it was mind blowing. And I definitely saw all that stuff way too early. But I think it was really, I think the height of the special effects films before CGI took over, where you saw all this wild stuff happening on a really big scale,
Yeah.
practically. And that was just, I think, fascinating to me and fascinating to everybody that ever saw it, because you're seeing now so much is, behind the scenes, it's like three people standing in front of a field of green with like one chair or something. And back then it's like 99% practical helicopters and all sorts of crazy stuff going on with maybe one element of VFX happening, if anything.
Are you on? Oh, go ahead.
No, no, you're good.
I was gonna say, are you kind of on the practicals always better camp, or have you come around to the VFX revolution, as it were?
I'm definitely into doing as much in camera as possible, which I think any DP is going to say. And I think, what you don't want to do is try to fix things. I think what I do really appreciate that we've been doing more and more on the productions that I'm involved with is using digital technology to give you invisible tools like erasing some dolly track or
Yep.
hiding a light if you just need to shoot a super wide shot of a room and you got nowhere to put a light. So you stick it in the ceiling and then shoot a plate without it and they remove it later, which I'm in a very fortunate position to be in that they can throw a VFX person at that for a day to fix that kind of problem. But I have not yet and don't necessarily look forward to a world where it's just people standing in front of a field of green and trying to figure out what the lighting and visual approach is going to be, because I really try to approach lighting as if everything needs to be in the room when you get there for the most part, and then you're just supplementing it and using that to be expressive however you want to be.
Yeah, that actually brings up two questions. One, how have LEDs changed the way you work? Because some people are kind of hesitant on them, sticking more with the traditional sources.
Oh no, I mean they're incredible. It's really the things that, besides the flexibility you get with them, the speed with which you can work with them is just like you can't. There's no comparison. I mean, the fact that we can have every light on set wireless, some of them on batteries, and they have full range of color options. It's particularly like the show that's airing now, the Afterparty. We, every episode is a different film genre, but we would block shoot all that stuff. So in one day we'd be switching between a John Wick movie and a romantic comedy and a thriller, and being able to build all of our lighting into our set and our environment and be able to very quickly switch between looks so that as soon as the actors are changed over, now we're in this totally new world, new genre. The set looks different. The tone on set feels different. The actors can respond to that. If we were running around and trying to gel 100 lights, it just wouldn't. I don't think a film, a show like this would be made, honestly, on a TV schedule. It just couldn't happen. Right. So the LEDs and the technology now, some of the lights we're using that are, beyond the RGB, the 8-channel color, ETC lights that are out now, the new Lecos, everything. The color depth is just incredible, that you can get a deep, deep red. It doesn't look clippy and weird or too, electric or artificial. It's the kind of organic colors you get now are just amazing. And so you can, we still use tungsten all the time, especially shooting on the lot. If you're trying to do giant window sources coming into a set, you're going to use, large Fresnel or HMI stuff. And the fact that now all of our, I say like within the set lighting, everything that's on the floor inside the room you're actually shooting can match color-wise to those tungsten units is just amazing.
Yeah, I've pretty much every DP I've interviewed, in however many it's been, 56 at this point, has mentioned their love of the Titan tubes. The Titan tubes seem to be in everyone's kit.
They're hard to argue with. They got great Wi-Fi. They're fast. It's a great. I feel like what you need to know how to control it, because they can kind of go everywhere. And we've all come up with our little rigs and little grids and things to keep everything tidy and flagging itself and everything. But yeah, it's amazing. And it just lets you get the light where you want the light to be. It's not like you always have to light from the far side of the room because that's where you can't see. Now I can have two things jammed into a corner right where the practical lamp is that you might have seen in the wide shot, and now that can become my source without taking over the set and hanging bounces up everywhere and doing crazy Tetrising of Leco bounces and stuff and yada yada.
Yeah, all the gaffers must absolutely love the iPad apps for some of these things. Just being able to stand next to the camera and go, yeah, change that.
Yeah, and to be able to stand with the director as well. Like on the Afterparty, we did a lot of tests beforehand. We came up with all of our looks, but Chris Miller and I could walk through the set with the gaffer and say, okay, let's look at a John Wick kind of action vibe, and then we're dialing in all our colors and everything, and then he can say like, I was thinking maybe it'd be a little more green, or maybe there should be an element of teal or some, maybe it's not blue, it's cyan or whatever. And just on a slider or with the hit of a button, you say, okay, do you like this? And get like real time response to it. And then move on, save the look, and then start working on another look. It's a very nice time to be it. But I do feel like the speed that we're now expected to work is kind of in line with how fast we can work. Whereas you used to be able to ask for a cut to change a scrim out, but now it's like, you just have to, between takes, make all your little adjustments. And usually while that's happening, the actor's saying, oh, the lights are, and you're like, no, just, you're fine.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting that the faster we can work, the faster you're kind of expected to work.
Yeah, it's that I don't know if I've mentioned it on this podcast, but there's an adage that's always ran through my head, which was, or maybe not an adage, but just kind of a anecdote, which was like, we, at some point people are making pins, like lapel pins, and they can make 100 a day. And then something happens where they can make 200 a day. We would expect in a just society that they would work half the time, because that way they could do the same output. But now they work twice as long. They make twice as many pins, and a bunch of waste happens, or maybe the quality goes down, Yeah,
I think that's what you're kind of always fighting. And it's something you're also just fighting with all the tools that you have, limiting yourself and not, I think the scary thing about the Titans is that you can do anything, and suddenly everything you see is pink and teal and crazy colors everywhere, and cues and dims and things. And it's like, you also have to accept that the world is not like that. And unless you're doing something that's intentionally expressive, or you want to be expressive in a certain way, you don't need to lean into the craziness and all the infinite possibilities that we now have with all the tools, the cranes, the Ronins, the cameras that can shoot, 5,000 ISO. You gotta rein that in and limit yourself a little bit. Otherwise you'll go a little crazy, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of naturally goes against the idea of having a palette, and making actually perfect example would be this show. Like, those limits create the, in this case, genres that you're trying to evoke, versus using all the tools all the time and making it look quote unquote interesting, Yeah. You had mentioned the John Wick episode, or influence for that, for Brett's episode. Is that his name? Yeah. How are you going? First of all, like, what were some of the influences for the other shows, and also how were you kind of changing from the base look for the investigation into these? Was the camera package changing, where they just color and light changes, or were they full? I know, like, the sets, or the like clothings and stuff, the clothing and stuff was changing a bit. But yeah, could you walk me through that a bit?
It was. We carried basically, the two main things we had to figure out how to do was have all these unique film genres, but also have the whole season be an arc, where it's not just a million different things. Like, everything has to be kind of has to make sense. We have our, like, we call it the, like, parlor mystery look, which is our main present timeline, which is Detective Danner and all these suspects and the interviews and all those things. And that needed to have its own kind of look that was more clinical and straightforward and less expressive. And then all the flashbacks had to be different in their own ways, but also kind of similar. So you'll see in the first 3 episodes, all the looks are anamorphic looks. They're all 2:3:5 aspect ratio. But in the first one, which is our romantic comedy, which is, the touchstones for that are like Hugh Grant movies, basically anything that's like warm and fuzzy and mostly backlit. Shot in, like, what's that?
And backlit.
Definitely backlit. That was like the funny thing that came up. We didn't realize until we were doing it. We're just like, this is like, to me, I always hate when you add a backlight just for the sake of adding a backlight. But in this instance, it's like everyone needs a backlight. That's just the aspirational tone of this look needs to be that. And we shot in studio mode. We had some crane work and mostly longer lenses. Like, everything was like over 50 unless it had to be wide because of the room you're shooting in or something.
Right.
And then, when you switch over to the action movie look, we're still anamorphic. It's still that aspect ratio, but now we're shooting all on the 28 and the 40, the really wide, crazy anamorphics. The camera's pushing in with the actor. It's much more subjective. It's following Brett because he's slinking around everywhere, and suddenly we're more in a handheld and steady cam environment. And then kind of going into the musical, which is more of a mixture of taking like a La La Land and then adding in some Justin Bieber music videos or something that's a little more contemporary, or like an 8 Mile rap battle type vibe or something like that. we're staying in anamorphic, but it's more about multiple cameras pushing in and out, and a glacier movement, stuff like that.
Yeah. Let's see, there's still one at the time of this recording. There's still one episode to go.
There's 2 more that have come out. There's actually 3 more. The most recent one is animated, which I did not have so much to do with other than the contemporary timeline, though it's incredible animation and very much in the Lord Miller wheelhouse of like convergence between reality and animated world. But the 4th episode was kind of a David Fincher thriller kind of thing with Alana Glazer telling her story. And that's where we saw a departure from, as part of this arc that we're creating, we left anamorphic. We stayed in the widescreen aspect ratio, but then we shot with H series Panavision lenses. We carried 4 sets of lenses, so I got very lucky, and Panavision was very kind when I pled with them to give me all their lenses. But we basically
let me take your whole stock.
They gave me some grief about it, but yeah, we had the Primo Artis for our kind of contemporary look. We had H series, we had some Arri Ultra Primes, and we had the T series anamorphic. So in that 4th episode, we kept the wide aspect ratio, but we went spherical, which is more of a nod to Fincher and his aversion to anamorphic. And that's where we really did try to be more subtractive. Whereas the first 3 episodes with lighting, it's all additive. It's adding a backlight. It's adding, in the action movie, it's putting tiny bright sources everywhere to create anamorphic flares. And, the music video is just craziness everywhere. But then with Chelsea, it's all about, for the thriller episode, it's all stripping it darker, creating mood with shadow, with rain, and the movement of, rain on a window, or more slow, foreboding camera, pushes and stuff like that. Which then, that kind of completes the first half of the season in terms of this like anamorphic look, which is all based more on what happened that night. And then in the newest episode, we jump back in time to high school. And now we're with all of our characters in high school. We've jumped so much farther back that we decided to go the opposite direction. And we went with like a 1:8:5 aspect ratio. We shot on zooms. The inspiration was originally like a Can't Hardly Wait, or those kind of like, Y2K party movies. But when after casting, they kind of realized that the reunion needed to be mid 2000s. And so Chris and I were talking about like, so what's the difference between a Y2K and a mid 2000s teen party movie? And the thing that I kind of pitched to him was how popular found footage movies were at that time. So we decided, and Chris was very cool about it, but we added a character who had a video camera, and we made that part of the look. So, the main look is zoom, spherical. We shot, rather than in full frame, we shot with the Sony Venice crop to Super 35 mode, which was another thing we did a lot, was jumping between a full frame format and a Super 35 format. So it's just a smaller sensor. We used lightweight zooms and much more handheld, and then kind of combine that with some very lo-fi video stuff to help tell the story through like a found footage sentiment.
Right. Yeah, it must have been a lot of fun to be able to, on one project, really stretch kind of all of your visual muscle, as it were.
Yeah, it was really fun. I mean, it's a crazy amount of work, but it's a cool reminder. I feel like I always have to tell myself while I'm lighting or doing whatever on set that we are in a vacuum. Anything can change. The window can be drawn, it can be open, the table can be on the other side of the room. We can get rid of that practical, add another practical. Like, you're always working in a world where you can really do anything until you've established it. And I think in this instance, you had to change things to keep it interesting, because we would retell the same story 3 times. And in version 1, we want it to feel like one thing, an action movie. In version 3, we want it to feel like a thriller. And so what are you adding or subtracting or manipulating to get you there? And that it's a lot of fun. It also requires a lot of enthusiasm from the gaffer, from the camera assistants, obviously from the art department, costume department, everyone. And something that Chris and Phil do so well at Lord Miller is they kind of bring a team that's excited about it. And so everyone was really just into the process. And we had a whole cheat sheet that had, anytime we're switching from, we named our looks based on the character that the flashback is portraying. So we had like the Unique look, the Brett look, the Chelsea look. And when we went to that, my camera system would say, okay, we're in Chelsea, we're in this format, we're this aspect ratio, these are the lenses we're using, this is the filtration we're using, because we usually switch filtration up a little bit. And
Sure.
we would shoot different ISOs. We kind of like the concept that Chris and I really try to run with was less about doing a LUT and like a big, like sweeping change. And it was more like a death by a thousand cuts approach. Like we'll change the ISO, we'll change the lens, we'll change the filter, we'll change the movement. And of course the lighting, the costumes, the set might change a little bit. And therein will be like the difference. And so everything still feels like it's of the same world, but there's all these tiny little, like, can you spot it differences? And so hopefully it worked.
Oh yeah, no, the show looks great, man. I was actually you brought him up. I was probably gonna ask this later, but did working with that Lord and Miller team, did they teach you anything that you're going to be kind of taking into your next few gigs? Anything that you kind of learned from them?
I think what they're really good at is having a plan, but being very open to changing things on the day. And that's something that, because they had a cast of incredible improvisers and performers, it wasn't so, shot listed and storyboarded and so carefully plotted out, which can be scary when you're trying to keep up with a TV schedule and you're just burning through a million pages a day with a lot of cast and a lot of coverage. And the way that they, the two major ways that they're helpful is that they're very willing to adjust and improvise as directors and filmmakers, but also that they are the showrunners, the writers, and Chris is the only director. So you're not trying to please someone else or provide all of the pieces of coverage that a studio might want if you were shooting as an episodic director,
right?
Alternating DP type kind of like classic TV formula. And that was very helpful because we could do things like rewrite a character in like in a major way in that high school episode where now we have this new person with a video camera. We thought of it 2 days ago. Now we're filming it, and you can just kind of, the best idea wins. That approach is like, it's really exciting and refreshing, especially in the TV space where it's less of an auteur's kind of environment for the most part.
Yeah, it does. I actually never thought about that because we've always pretty much everyone I've interviewed on this podcast have all said how television seems to be the next. It used to be the past, now it's the future. All these amazing shows are coming out on the streaming platforms. But you bring up an excellent point that the things that made the sort of 70s and 90s great potentially could be attributed to more auteur style filmmaking. And I never really put that together.
Yeah, and just having that single voice, which is very nice.
Yeah, that's I'll have to think about that a little bit more. Because that could be the source of some good questions in the future. Was there a look that you sort of gravitated towards? Like, was there one that you were more excited about potentially?
There's a yet unaired one that I'm very excited about, and I don't know when this airs, but it's going to be next week, and it'll
be after next week, so you can leak it.
All right, so there's another deep flashback where we kind of revisit the detective's backstory. And that was, we call it the gritty cop look. It's about her as like a young rookie cop in LA. And that we try to lean into some like Tony Scott type vibes without flying too close to the action movie world. And that to me was a lot of fun because it was much looser. The camera movement was very handheld, very, moving through space. It was not nearly as carefully plotted out. And after, we shot that later in the schedule just because of Tiffany's availability. And so after months of kind of a more controlled approach, it was very exciting to get into like grittier, more fluid space. But I think that the action space, the action scene was kind of the most fun because we're doing car chases, we're doing fights and all sorts of stuff that is just like outside of the normal, like people sitting around at a table talking to each other environment. Of course, is going to be so much fun. And also, as someone that doesn't like to be too in your face with the lighting and the movement, I don't want people to notice it too much. It was fun to have an excuse to go big and be like, this is in the language of what we're trying to do. It's not self-aggrandizing. It's meant to be kind of crazy and expressive in a way that I think I don't normally approach something.
Yeah. Actually, that brings up a sort of counter question, which is, what is your approach to kind of that standard? For instance, the interrogation, let's call them scenes, the interview scenes, the base look. Like, what kind of nuts and bolts are you doing to get those looks?
It's really starts so much with talking with, reading and talking with the director, but also working with the production designer, because the way that I want a space to be set up, it needs to be how the space presents it. And so what I mean is that, like, a term I use a lot of times in order to get the set decorator on my side is to say, like, I want the set to light itself. I don't want to come in with a bunch of tools and fill your space with my lights and move your furniture out of the way and see less of the space because I've got to get all the lights in. Like, I want to work with you to create a space that is basically lit by the space, with sconces, with practicals, with a window that's placed in the right orientation to the table the characters will be sitting in. And generally, I think that's how you should approach everything. And then from there, you figure out how to be expressive with it. So if you want it to be a more expressive scene, you have to work with them to set those things up for you. If you want to, if you want to make it a dramatic firelit scene, you need to make sure there's a fireplace in the room or whatever, you know what I mean? Right. Like, and so I always try to approach it. And when I walk into a lighting setup, my gaffer and I, we probably to our own fault, we always have to figure out, like, all right, where is the light coming from? Like, it might be a cell phone. It might be sun skipping off the floorboards. It could be a car headlights out a window. It could be whatever, but you've got to find a way to rationalize it in your mind, at least in my mind, so that I'm not just saying, okay, key, fill, backlight, whatever, over and over again, formulaic. And
compulsive filmmaking, as I've called it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's hard with the speed that you're expected to work, the stress and the pressure of it all. It's very easy to fall back on what you know is going to work. You've done this, every time I've done a process trailer shot, we've lit it in some certain way because I know it'll work. There won't be shadows of lights projecting through the window onto the actors, whatever. But I think you also have to kind of push yourself and remind yourself that there are a million ways to do it. And the Afterparty is a good example of being forced to come up with 10 ways to do everything, because you're like, legitimately, I'll get fired if I don't present them with 8 different looks. You know what I mean? Yeah.
It's it must have been almost kind of meditative to have to, like, what is every possible thing I can get out of this scene or whatever, how can I do this so many ways? Yeah.
And it's great. I mean, I have an incredible team. The people I work with, I mean, the thing that I always talk about is, I always say that I have all the good phone numbers. I have a lot of people that great camera operators, steady cam operators, gaffers, and I've been lucky enough to work with some filmmakers that are open to pushing things and bring their own ideas. Usually, I mean, it's all based on what has been brought from the script and what the director wants to do, really, that inspires me. And then I might have a suggestion that inspires them. And it's, it's super fun.
Yeah. I was just talking with Jeff Cronin
cool.
But that episode, that's going to tell everyone when this was recorded, but that's coming out much later. But yeah, he really hammered home how important that collaborative environment is to the health of a film or a show. Yeah.
Well, and it's an amazing place to work because everyone legitimately wants to do their best job, because your resume is based on this thing succeeding and you pulling off what you're trying to do. So it's cool to be in an environment where everyone wants to do their best, from the focus puller to the mixer to whomever. It's like, it's such a cool space to work in that way.
Yeah, like I was saying before we recorded, like I just worked on a short over the weekend, and it had been, obviously like about 2 years since I'd been on a set, and mostly doing editing and coloring over the pandemic. But I had forgotten how, I suppose gratifying is the right word, but sort of maybe addictive that rapid fire problem solving process becomes.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a drug a little bit. It's a little weird during COVID to be down and not feel that kind of rush of like problem solving challenges and just flexing creativity a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I know we kind of got to let you go a little earlier than normal, but I always like to end with the same two questions, although I'm modifying them as I go. But the first one is just maybe if you can remember something you've read or maybe a piece of advice that you were given that has really stuck with you throughout your career, or maybe even recently that kind of changed your perspective in an appreciable way.
Besides comfortable shoes, I would say.
Okay, time out. What are the comfortable shoes? Because I actually have an
Well, actually,
Amazon
I'm the
list.
worst offender of this. I wear boots at work, and I get
Oh no.
shit for it all the time. But you know what? There was a moment. I was working with a gaffer in Atlanta, and I had just gotten Barry, which is the show I just wrapped, and I'm very excited for everyone to see. It comes out in April, and I was definitely nervous about it because the show is a beloved show. I've not worked on it in the past. I wanted to come in. I wanted to keep it propped up to the level it's at, but also add to it and not be, anyways, I was talking to the gaffer about like my certain amount of anxiety about like how am I gonna, do this? And he told me a story about how when he first worked as a young electrician on a John Toll movie, and he got to set, he sees blocks and blocks of trucks and catering and all the different people and departments and props and everything, just the giant, circus that is a film production, and made his way, into the stage or wherever they were filming, and, finally got to the set. And at the end of all of this craziness, it was just John Toll with a camera and a grip with a 2x2 bounce board and nothing else, like a table lamp. And I think the big advice that I took from that is not only that we're all humans that can actually do this stuff, but right. that even with all of the tools in the world, you should approach every scene in the simplest way that gives you what you're trying to express or what the director's seeking. And don't be so bothered by the enormity of the process, because it really doesn't matter. It's just what you're capturing in that moment that you're doing it. It's every single thing is just getting filtered through, the camera in that moment. So
yeah,
I really appreciate that.
Keeping it simple, but not simplistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Second question is, well, it's hard. So I changed the second question. It used to be name a movie people should watch that isn't yours. But I kind of like where it changed, which is hard with a series. But if the Afterparty's in a double feature, what's the other movie?
Oh, man.
Imagining that it's a
and we're talking about a series. A past film?
Any film. I mean, it would, if it's just on the bill, it's on the New Bev sign out front, the Afterparty followed by or before, I guess, in your head canon.
I don't know. I mean, we really were looking to stuff like Clue when we were making the movie as our way of, but that seems a little pretty far separated in time for that to be the double billing.
Not really. That's how I always think about it. I'm like looking at how a film was informed by film. Like something I really try to latch onto or be a conduit for is the history of the art form. It's only, how old's filmmaking? 120 years old.
Yeah.
So it's a young medium. So relatively, but it does seem like we're starting to forget some of the old masters, or at least some of the where we came from. Not you and I specifically, but we as a whole. So if you want to go as far back as you want, that's fine for the quote unquote double feature.
Great. Well, then I think Clue would be a good one, because that was something that I think Chris really, he wanted to create a new generation's version of that experience. And I think we've had a couple of them, but I think what those two are so good at is just creating a fun filmmaking experience. They're very creative. They have incredible artistic merit, but they also are willing to give the audience the best possible time, no matter what that means. And we have some stuff coming up that I think is extremely fun, but not necessarily what you would put on your cinematography reel in that way. But it's perfect for what the story is, and it's perfect for, riding this tone of kind of suspense and comedy, which is is kind of a hard place to be.
Yeah. No, it's actually one thing that I had heard about Clue that I didn't know, but I should have. Is I thought it came out in the same way that you and I probably saw it, which is where you get all the endings. Mm-hmm. But apparently in theaters, each audience got a different ending.
Oh, so really?
Everyone left the theater or would talk to their friends about it later and be like, "Oh, that's not what happened for me."
That's funny. That's interesting. I was just talking to my camera assistant because we are watching the show with our wives, and our wives all have their theories about who the killer is. And of course, we have a pretty good idea. But we were talking about how interesting it would be if Chris could get so meta with it that it's a different person, and whatever we filmed on set could be recontextualized and re-edited. And even the filmmakers themselves would be surprised. That would be an impressive feat that I would not hold past those two.
That would be cool, and that that would push the art form a little bit, which I think would be pretty interesting. Well, thanks again, man, for your time.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
Having me. Yeah. I love the podcast. It's very fun. You've got some awesome guests. So
thanks, man. I really appreciate that. And yeah, when Barry comes out, come back and we can chat about that.
Would love to.
Awesome.
All right.
Have a good afternoon, man.
Appreciate it. You too.
Frame and Reference is an Owlbot production. It's produced and edited by me, Kenny McMillan, and distributed by Pro Video Coalition. Our theme song is written and performed by Mark Pelly, and the F&R Mattbox logo was designed by Nate Truax of Truax Branding Company. You can read or watch the podcast you've just heard by going to provideocoalition.com or youtube.com/owlbot, respectively. And as always, thanks for listening.